Let's talk about it on our roundtable, joined by Christie, Rahm Emanuel, the CEO of Democracy for America, Bette Simpson, and Jane Coaston, host of the New York Times podcast, The Argument. Chris, let me begin with you. In that statement, Biden also said he didn't really understand. He's mystified by what the Republican Party is going through. So try to explain it right now. You spoke out against the idea that the election was stolen from the very beginning, but that view seems to be taking more hold every single day.
Look, I don't think it is taking more hold every single day, George. You're talking about the same people talking about the same things.
70% of Republicans don't think
over and over. Well, listen, all I can tell you is that the people that I talk to are not in that camp and want to move on. And they want to talk about what we need to do next in the country. And actually, if you look at this, absent the atmospherics that everybody wants to talk about regarding Donald Trump, Elise Stefanik, as John said in his piece, comes from a swing district in New York State that President Obama won twice by double digits, and then President Trump won twice by double digits. So she comes from a place where it's much more likely that she'll bring a much more moderating voice on policy into that caucus leadership than what Liz Cheney did, who voted 90% of the time with Donald Trump. So
you have the right qualifier there, though, on policy.
Well, George, of course, I say my words very carefully. Okay, that's what you guys pay me to do here, right? Is to say it the right way, and that's what she'll do. And listen. I've known Elise. I campaigned for Elise in her first campaign. She was the youngest woman elected to the House of Representatives, and I think Elise will bring some real good things to it. I also like Liz Cheney, and I think Liz is smart and tough. But I think Liz is doing what she wants to do. I don't think Liz wants to be in leadership anymore, because once she won the vote earlier, she continued to press this issue publicly in a way that was antagonizing the people who were against her. And I think you don't have an entitlement to be in leadership, but you do have an entitlement to be in Congress.
Jane Coaston, a lot of Democrats look at Liz Cheney and say, we don't know what to make of this. A strong conservative, should we be cheering her or walking away?
I mean, I think that you can be looking at the situation with a jaundiced eye, because this is the same Liz Cheney who went hard after attorneys who defended people sent to Guantanamo Bay. She was the person who called them the Al-Qaeda 7, as if they themselves were terrorists. But this is also someone who has said the obvious fact, which is that Joe Biden won the presidential election. And to your point about moving on, I mean, I think that the person who's going on Steve Bannon's podcast is the person who perhaps isn't moving on, the person who is so focused on the agenda of the person who, once again, lost the election. Donald Trump lost the election. His agenda is whatever he wants to be doing right now in Florida. He does not have, I think, the agenda of the country moving forward at heart. And I think that it's important to note here, again, I don't think this is what the majority of Republicans want, but this is a base play. The base in these state parties, the base in Ohio is the one that wants to censure Representative Anthony Gonzalez. The base in Arizona is the one looking for bamboo threads in voting, because apparently pandas are in charge of this election. I think that it's important to say that this is not what conservatism writ large looks like. This is what Trumpism at large looks like.
By the way, I don't disagree with one thing you just said. Okay, but the point is, there's not an entitlement to being in leadership, and I think Liz, through what she's been doing now in the last couple weeks after she won the first vote, is sending a clear signal. She's not comfortable in this leadership anymore, and she doesn't want to be in it. She hasn't made any calls.
Donald Trump's the one calling her a warmonger, which, again, if he cared about that, why would he be supporting Lindsey Graham?
The question, Rahm Emanuel, is Lindsey Graham right, or is Liz Cheney right? Is it necessary to stick by Donald Trump here, or is it important for the future of the Republican Party for them to move on?
Well, a couple of things. Jane has said the word, conservative or agenda. First of all, this is not a conservative party. You want to look at a conservative party, pick up John Boehner's book, pick up former President Bush's book. That's conservative. This is a reactionary party built on both resentment and race. That is where the party's going. Second, the other piece of this is you talk about an agenda. In 2020, there was no platform. There's no agenda. It's about Donald Trump. Parties exist for two reasons. Set out a set of policy principles. They didn't have that in 2020. They still don't have that. Number two, to win elections. It took 90 years to find a president that could both lose the White House, the House, and the Senate, and Donald Trump did that. This is about Donald Trump and his grievances. And the other piece of this that makes no sense to me, you have an election. There are three things that both parties have. The Republicans have redistricting. They have basically restricting voter access, and they are going to also have the ability in this area to cut off any part of history they have. Well, Democrats have an economy, a president with a job approval that's above 50%. In the midterms, that has not happened. And then the third piece on that, they have a popular agenda where a quarter of the Republicans are supporting. In the last election, Joe Biden took 10% of the Republican Party. This is not good for swing voters.
But Yvette Simpson,
for Republicans.
On policy, the moves in Texas and Florida will help the Republican Party.
They will, and that's the whole objective. Let's remember that this is the basis of this is supposed to be voter fraud that didn't happen. And the reality is what they're reacting to is the fact that Donald Trump legitimately lost the election because Democrats got voters out, Black and brown voters in large numbers, and their objective is to keep that from happening again. This is about stealing an election. This is about eroding democracy. This is about making sure that they win. And they know that the only way they can win is by stealing an election. And that's not okay. And this is, as Ram said, the only real policy objective outside of racism, QAnon conspiracy theory, white supremacy that we can see coming, and insurrection, we can see coming out of this party right now, which is a shame.
Look at this. You have Matt Gaetz that's being investigated for trafficking in underage women. You have accusations about a congressman from North Carolina what he did in college and lied about his resume. You have accusations of a congresswoman from Illinois who praised what Hitler did in the Holocaust. They are staying in the caucus. They are staying on committees. But if you speak up against Donald Trump and you say, Joe Biden won the election, you are thrown out of this party.
And
that
Chris,
tells you something.
I mean, they're the representatives. They're the standard bearers now. You have these people out here in rallies saying Donald Trump is the one. We love Donald Trump. You hear Marjorie Greene, you hear Matt Gaetz really riling up these people saying we are the party of Trump. They are the standard bearers
Chris,
for this party now.
You say the most Republicans want to move on. Clearly, the former president doesn't want to move on. To the extent he's getting involved in politics at all right now, it's handpicking people in the primaries, coming out with messages against Republicans when they cross him.
Well, it's not productive. But we shouldn't be surprised. That's the way he has felt since 2:30 a.m. on election night, when we sat at the other studio and watched him give that speech. So this is nothing new here. Let me just say, I was in Dallas and Austin on Thursday and Friday. In Austin, Texas, there were 8 different leaders of the Republican Party, people like Mike Pompeo to Marco Rubio and others who were there to speak about the future of the party. No one spoke. It was 8 hours of interviews of leaders of the party, myself included, and no one spoke about the 2020 election. No one spoke about bamboo and ballots. Nobody spoke about grievance politics. They were talking about conservative agenda to move forward. It's 15 weeks into the Biden administration, and everyone wants the Republican Party to have reformed itself, learned from 2020, and moved on to the next thing. It doesn't happen that quickly in politics. And if you look back at 2016 with the Democrats, it didn't happen that quickly with them either. There were leaders, like I said, Mike Pompeo, Rick Scott, Tim Scott, myself, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, all who spoke in Austin on Friday afternoon. And not one of them brought up any of the issues that we're talking about here this morning.
But Marco Rubio is the same person who wants to punish Amazon specifically for what they're doing. And I think it's interesting that now we've gotten into a grievance politics that's beyond Trump. It's about punishing corporations, the same corporations that Republicans have been giving tax breaks to for 40 years, but for not doing exactly what they wanted. Yeah. And I think it's worth saying also, about your point about voters, we also saw millions of non-white Americans who did vote for Republicans in 2020. They voted first in many states, in Florida and Texas. They went to the ballot box. They voted to raise the minimum wage, legalize medical marijuana, and they voted for Donald Trump.
Do you know why?
Yeah.
I think because voters are a complicated group of people. And I think occasionally when we're talking about non-white voters, we tend to think of them as just being a monolith. That's why I always make a joke
100%.
about the black community.
100%. The biggest, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the biggest piece of this election that hasn't been discovered is how Hispanic and Asians, by about a third, voted for Republicans, and college-educated men who've historically been Republican voted Democratic, and that has not been discovered. The other thing, let me say this, we talked about Trump. The big story here is McCarthy. McCarthy in 2016. Kevin McCarthy, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I want to make sure you weren't going to Joe, and I was wondering where that was.
That would really, we could go Joe McCarthy or Gene McCarthy. But in 2016, Kevin McCarthy, on a call with the Republican leadership, said he thinks Putin controls Trump. And every time Liz Cheney spoke, it shows up that he is an empty suit, and he wants to get rid of her. He's not just doing Donald Trump's bidding. He does not want a leadership that shows him up and says that he can't stand up and speak honestly. It is a lot also about Kevin McCarthy. And the other piece of this, which is interesting to me, in the first 15 weeks, The Republican attacks on Joe Biden are about what is infrastructure, about running up the credit card. What is interesting to me is that they are silent about the taxes. The Republican Party is becoming a working class party, and they don't want to fight about corporations.
They are.
Are they becoming a working class party?
No,
because again, they are not angry
during
at
the campaign. During the campaigns, they're a working class party, and when they govern, they give nothing but corporate welfare away.
Given the economic numbers on Friday, they're trying to find a message around that. Let's listen to Pat Toomey, the outgoing senator from Pennsylvania.
Systematically paying unemployment benefits that are more than a person makes working doesn't create an environment that's particularly conducive to going back to work. We're getting a little Orwellian with when it comes to the language we hear from this administration sometimes.
Can they get traction with this argument?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the reality is that wages are so low at this point. We need to talk about the fact that people will return to work if you have a working class wage, if you have a living wage for people. And so the idea of Republicans or economists who say that people aren't going back to work because they want to sit home is ridiculous. And the reality is that you have to show that you're looking for work in order to get unemployment benefits. We need to talk about having a living wage in this country that makes it so that people go to work, and when they go to work, they can have a living wage. And that should be the reason. And businesses are going to continue to remain shuttered if we don't talk about making sure that we get a minimum wage so that people can go back to work. We don't even have a way for people to get child care in this environment because there are some people who can't quite yet figure that situation out because of COVID. So I think it's ridiculous. And I still think that this is not about black and brown people who were voting for Trump. We know that the voter suppression laws in this country, the ones that we're seeing in Texas and the ones we're seeing in Florida, are about urban areas where black people are voting for Democrats.
Right.
We saw Trump supporters storming election centers on election day.
Anyway.
He did do better, and yet it doesn't seem to matter to the party. It's a very strange messaging of people saying, yes, more minorities are voting for conservative candidates, but we need fewer minorities voting at all. And that's a message that just doesn't make sense.
That's not what they're saying. They're saying we want certain black people, certain black and brown people. We know that a lot of these laws are focused on urban centers, places where black people overwhelmingly voted for Democrats. We're talking about purity laws that are aimed at cities where mostly black people are voting for Democrats. And so we know this is an orchestrated method to try to resolve the issue of the last election.
And we saw that in 2020. We're talking about Milwaukee.
Go ahead. They were saying that they're not talking about issues, but there are things that are being talked about beyond what Rahm sets up as the Republican agenda, which I love when he does that.
Happy Mother's Day.
Paying attention.
Yeah, you now have the head of the CDC, who has essentially become Randy Weingarten's assistant at the American Federation for Teachers. We saw this past week that the CDC set out a plan to send kids back to school based on science. And until Randy Weingarten and her team sent in the emails to the CDC, and then all of a sudden that policy changed. And now we still have less than half of the kids back to school in classrooms around this country because the teachers union does not want their members to have to go back into the classrooms even after they're vaccinated.
Well, the reality
no. Listen, I let you go on all morning this morning. The fact is,
talking about teachers. And
we're talking about the teachers union. I'm talking about the union. Yeah, no. Know what they are? They're politicians. They're politicians who get paid millions of dollars a year. They're politicians who get paid $1 million a year to be able to represent teachers, and they don't represent them well. They don't represent them well.
The regular worker makes, but when teachers represent themselves, you have a problem, and they're protecting themselves and families.
I have a problem with the policy.
I'm going to just use my indoor voice. We just ran, which is unusual. I'm having an out-of-body experience now. You just ran Senator Toomey. He went on about the spending, nothing about taxes. Now, I didn't see just that segment. That used to be an organizing principle of the Republican Party. They don't want to fight about corporations that don't pay taxes, the top 1% that don't pay taxes have a lower tax rate.
Right.
And that is my saying is you have a big realignment going on in the country. Republicans used to agree on taxes. They have become a party of grievance, and they've become a party of resentment dominated by one personality. And the Republican Party cannot win swing districts where Donald Trump is still the dominating face and voice of this party. And that's where they're going to take a historic opportunity in a midterm and pass it right by.
But Jane Costa, the Democrats can't pass Biden's agenda, which includes those tax increases that Rahm is talking about, unless they unify their party, and the divisions are still there.
I mean, I think that they are still there, but I also think it's worth noting that one of the challenges we have here when we're talking about taxes or the changes to tax reform is that Democrats are pretty united on the fact that corporations need to pay their fair share, and Republicans are united that corporations they don't like need to pay their fair share. The Republicans
Selective
aren't
judgment.
angry at Amazon because they are forcing their employees to urinate in bottles. They're angry at Amazon because they didn't sell a book they like. And so I think it's worth it.
Or because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post.
Right, which, that's something that I'm sure is really deeply important to Amazon employees who are forced to work 15-hour days. I'm sure they're very concerned about the operations of the Washington Post. But I think it's worth saying that, a lot of these tax ideas, and it's interesting because when Donald Trump came into office in the 2015-2016 campaign, the people closest to him were saying, we have to make this about workers. We have to make this about, he's like, oh, this is going to kill me if we raise tax rates, but I'm going to do it anyway. He didn't do it anyway. That didn't happen.
Mr. Half of his operations were in China or somewhere else. America first. Donald Trump cared about workers.
I think that goes to my point that Mitch McConnell proved to be a much stronger influence on Donald Trump than Donald Trump became on Mitch McConnell. But I think that this realignment that Ron was talking about, I think that is true. But I also think that for Democrats, it's worth noting that this is a very specific context. They're just coming out of a very successful the COVID package, which was a COVID package that I think in some ways was directed by the events of 2020. When you have a moment where it's you can either give people checks or not give people checks, it turns out you should just give people checks. And I think that the decisions moving forward are going to turn out to be far more difficult, but I'm pretty certain Democrats can maintain that type of unity. I do think that some of the battles in swing districts will be about schools, but I think that a lot of that's going to be resolved later in the year. And I think that it's going to be about events that we're just not sure what things are going to look like. We're not sure about future breakthrough.
It won't be resolved later in the year because the damage that we've done to children's education
in
September of last year, the parents are not going to forget that. They're not going to forget. No, listen, Yvette, you want to know who's talking? No, you want to talk about who's talking about elitist stuff and who isn't?
I went to public school.
Yeah, and so did I.
Public schools,
and
I
so
know
did I.
that most of these schools are not even outfitted to bring all of these kids back.
That's not what the science says,
They
Yvette.
don't have the facilities to keep people spread out.
That's not what the science says.
We have teachers who are caring for elder parents.
That's not what the
worried about their
no one
own
else is.
safety.
Wait,
They have been teaching.
Are the food workers taking care of elder parents? We made them go back. We made them go back, Yvette.
Kids who are remote and they're teaching.
Here, I want to say one
thing. We made them go back.
I want to say
Special class.
They're working harder than ever.
Now they're
one thing I would just say is you have the policy positions of the parties haven't caught up to the realignment of going on the coalition. And the two lines about there's different things that happen this election that are going to keep rippling through the alignment of the parties, but the policy positions of those parties. Over 50% of the Republican Party supports tax fairness and making corporations and wealthies pay, which is why the Republicans can't make this a major thrust against the Biden agenda.
Right, it's why they can't use taxes as a punishment.
That's right.
Write a lot of open
and that's why
letters.
there's a major realignment both on coalition voting and on the issue basis.
That is going to have to be the last word today. Thank you all very much. Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.